I think it would be good to read James 1:6-8, because that talks about divided heart. Would someone read James 1:6-8?
But let him ask in faith with no doubting. For he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. I just said that wrong somehow.
No, this is the thing that's important, to be totally focused.
Let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is he's a double-minded man and unstable in all his ways.
Yeah, you can't be double-minded. When you come to the Lord, you have to know who He is, and God will reward you. And you have to trust in Him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, loving Him, believing in Him.
A word or something. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded.
That's fine. No, that's fine. You got it. That's fine. It says, that guy who's double-minded and he doubts, don't let him think that he'll receive anything from the Lord. How's that? Does that make more sense to you? Don't let him think he's going to get anything, because you can't come to the Lord with doubt. Now, God accepts our doubts, but He helps us to overcome our doubts. Now, in today's world, it's almost people are encouraging doubts and lifting up everyone's doubts and saying, just go ahead and doubt. But Jesus said, who was the famous doubter in the New Testament? Thomas. And did Jesus say, that's great that you doubt, I'll leave you in your doubts, keep doubting? No. He said, come here and put your hand in my side and in the holes of my hand. Overcome your doubts and see there's evidence for your faith. And our faith is not a blind leap of faith. It's based on evidence, the biggest one being an empty tomb and the appearance of a resurrected Lord. That's evidence for our faith, which is quite different than, let's take Hinduism with its 5 million gods and goddesses. Those are all kind of made-up fairy tale type things. They can't say, well, this is where we saw him, and he had a house built here. It's all made up type stuff. Whereas our Bible and the New Testament, they're always discovering evidences for the truth of the Bible. Did you read last week? They've discovered what they believe to be the house where Jesus turned water into wine. And they have those big pottery jars and everything, and there's writings on the wall and stuff like this was a place of pilgrimage for early Christians from the first century. That this was
found one of the pots, or
they found the house where the wedding was in Cana, I believe it is.
But he did it in the water was turned into wine.
Yeah, so the water in those pots he turned to wine. But what I'm saying is, it's real, tangible evidence, archaeological, that it's there, and it supports the Bible. And every time we go to the Bible, every year, it seems like they're discovering more.
That you don't have to know what the details are, why they think it's that particular house or something?
Well, because of the location, and like I said, apparently it was a pilgrimage place for early Christians, saying this was where this happened, and there was graffiti on the walls and stuff showing that. So interesting find. So we have all these archaeological evidence and discoveries that should confirm our faith. So if we have doubts, we can say, look, here it is, evidence, evidence. And that's what Jesus wants us to do. And He doesn't want us to be double-minded. And this is what was happening in Israel at this time. Verse 2, their hearts divided. So I think one of the best verses is the next one from 1 Kings 18 that really describes the situation. If someone could read 1 Kings 18:21 on our paper.
And Elijah came to all the people and said, how long will you falter between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow Him. But if Baal, follow him. But the people answered him not a word.
I love that last sentence. They're just standing there, dumbstruck, because they know that he's right. And he's saying, look, you can't just go between two opinions. If Baal is the God, go and worship him. If Jehovah God is, worship him. But don't keep going back and forth, which is what Israel had been doing all these years.
But the people were awestruck, huh? They didn't have an answer?
Yeah, they didn't have an answer. So yeah, he's kind of right, I guess. See, Elijah was up here at the time of Ahab, and he's countering, he's fighting the priests of Baal and all them. And so they're supposed to be worshiping God, but they've got Baal worshipers mixed in with Jehovah God, and he's saying it's one or the other. You can't have both. And this is the problem today with what is termed interfaith. Have you heard of interfaith? Not just ecumenical, and here's what I mean. Ecumenical started as basically different Christian denominations. Episcopal, Presbyterian, Methodist, even, well, Catholics never really got into it. But now interfaith is not just Christian denominations. What's interfaith? Everything. Yeah, all religions. Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, we want to all get them together. And this is the thing. The popes, going back to John Paul II, have had interfaith gatherings for prayer and worship. They start in Assisi, Italy, and this Pope, Francis, who's got a lot of problems right now, he's had these interfaith gatherings with charismatic Pentecostals, Protestants, Muslims, Hindus, all wanting to come together and worshiping together. Tell me, what's the problem with that?
Well, they're worshiping different gods.
They're worshiping different gods.
I mean,
exactly.
one God.
You can't say, well, we're all worshiping the same God. No, you're not. And the whole Old Testament is proving this point over and over. That's why we study Old Testament. In Hosea, you've got, I'm the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. It's not just the same God with a different name. It's a totally different God and different religious books and different ideas. So this idea, we've got to be discerning as a church when it comes to interfaith ecumenical
Is that
gathering.
one of the big things historically, that the belief in monotheism was so unusual at the time, and that still is, I guess, to some fair degree, where you have three in one, but you have one God?
Well, that's the difference all the other religions say about Christianity.
Right.
And they say, oh, you are a pagan, have different gods. And we say, no, we're three in one. And especially the Muslims say that we worship different gods. They think they're the original monotheists. They worship Allah. But to have worship together with them gives the impression to the world that there's no difference. We're all one.
All roads lead to the same
Yeah.
God.
All roads lead to the same God. Or someone that said it's like a mountain and God's on top of the mountain and you're climbing up the north side and someone else climbing up the south. But you all get to the same pinnacle. No, that's wrong. And the reason it's wrong, you just go to the Bible and you can see it.
Well, I was just reading here in Revelations where it talks about the lukewarm church. And he's very clear that he wants you to either be hot or cold. Because
Right.
if you're not, he's going to spew you out of his mouth.
Yeah, yeah.
And to me, that is saying either you are for me or you're against me. You're either going to worship me or you're going to worship.
Yeah, you're going to worship me alone or I'll vomit you out of my mouth.
You out of my mouth.
And so
Very
that's
clear.
Jesus Christ saying that in his revelation to John.
He said he's jealous.
He's a jealous God because he created us, he's given us life, and we just ignore him. We go away from him.
He says, thou shalt have no other God before me.
Yeah,
I mean, it's so plain.
it's very plain, but people today want to put tolerance above truth. And you can't always do that. Truth has to win out because everything can't be true. If something's true, then the opposite of that has to be false.
Well, there's my truth and there's your truth.
Well, that's the thing they have today.
That's what they have.
And so we have to be sure that we are, as a church, discerning and worshiping the one true God in all our preaching, teaching, studying, and in our associations, because we are giving a witness to the world who's watching us around us. So if we all go over to worship together at the tabernacle on the 1st of January, and they have a Muslim imam, and she read from the Quran, and all these people were there. Now, I've talked to some who were there, and they said, well, just because we're there together doesn't mean we leave our beliefs at the door. But do you see the image it gives to the surrounding people who don't go? They say, oh, it's all the same. Doesn't make any, well, it is. It's not all the same. There is a difference.
Now, Muhammad was some 600-800 years, or at least his poetry or whatever, after the
Jesus.
burial and resurrection of Christ,
Yeah,
right?
500 to 600 years.
Are they a toss-up, splinter group with Christianity then? I mean, they have Allah, which I guess...
Yeah. They actually grew out of a lot of the pagan beliefs of Arabia. They go and walk around this big black stone in Mecca, and that used to be worshipped as some kind of pagan god. So Muhammad said, no, we're going to worship one God, Allah, but we'll include all these other beliefs. And then he's taken things from the Christian Bible. In fact, they say believe the Gospels. The Muslims do, but they don't have the same Jesus. And they've taken things from the Jewish beliefs. But they say, well, we're the final one. You had Jews and Christians, now we're the final Islam.
They like to think themselves as Abrahamic.
Yeah, and this is another thing that you'll see today, is we're all Abrahamic descendants. So we're all the Abrahamic faiths. We should be together as Abrahamic faith. Well, Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father but by me, and I am the Son of God. Father and I are one. Whoever's seen me has seen the Father. And before Abraham was what? I am. Well, Muslims say, I can't believe that. And so there is division. It's naturally going to be a division. And the Christians have to stand up for the truth of what it is. So I think today, in today's world, it's going to be harder and harder to make a stand for the exclusivity of Jesus Christ and the Christian faith. But see, that's what it was. That's one of the reasons we study this Old Testament, was the same way. Can you imagine Baal and Israelites? They were kind of saying, well, yeah, we worship Baal and we worship God too. It's all one. Let's go to the Baal temple and then we'll go to our altars. And God was saying, no, it can't be that way. So these are informative studies for us. But let's go on with verse 3. Someone read verse 3 from our paper.
For now they say, we have no king because we did not fear the Lord. And as for a king, what would he do for us?
Now this is interesting because it's almost like if they're admitting they've gone away from God, and that's why they don't have a king. They're not really looking toward a king. And then they say, so even if we had a king, what good would he do for us? They're kind of on their own anyway. And they're admitting we have no king. But they did. Look at all the kings they had. They had over 20 kings. And the last one is Hosea. It's a SH sound, not Hosea. And Hosea was the last king, and he entered into some bad covenants with surrounding kings. But none of these kings were chosen by God. And they're saying, what would he do for us anyway? So these were not chosen by God, and they weren't really leading the people into an understanding of God and His Word. Let's go ahead and read this Hosea 8:4 underneath there, somebody.
They set up kings, but not by me. They made princes, but I did not acknowledge them. From their silver and gold they made idols for themselves, that they might be cut off.
So Hosea is affirming there. They set up kings, and these are the words of God, but not by me. And they made princes, but I didn't acknowledge them. So they're going on their own, and they're picking out leaders, but God didn't pick them out. Who was the first king of Israel? Saul. Did God pick him out? Yes, God picked him out. Who was the second king?
David.
And who did God pick him out? Yes, God picked him
Who
out.
was the second one?
David. And God chose them. Who was after David? Solomon. God picked him. But now they've gotten in this, from Jeroboam on, it doesn't look like they're too really chosen by God so much. Although God is over everything, and he sees and lifts up and pulls down. But he's saying here, Hosea, they set up kings, but not by me, and I didn't acknowledge the princes that they set up. So,
that struck me in verse 3. Now they say, we have no king because we did not fear the Lord. Then they go on to say, as you point out, as for a king, what would he do for us? Well, that's entirely opposite from their first demand to have
right.
him and all the things they thought he would do for them.
Yeah.
It didn't work.
They're acknowledging that they're wrong, that God could do these things for them, but kings can't. It's kind of like self-evaluation there, sorts.
They're admitting that they've gotten away from God, but big deal. So what would a king do for us anyway?
But they had asked for a king to start with.
Yeah, and they wanted it to be just like the other kingdoms around them, and so God gave them Saul. We'll get into that when we turn the page.
It seems like part of the human dilemma there, we want tangible things, even with God. I.e., Thomas, they want a golden calf, or they want this, that, or the other. That seems to be human nature, some innate thing we want to be able to put our hands on or see it.
Well, Jesus said, the spirit's willing, but the flesh is weak. He acknowledged we needed help in our faith, so he gave us the Lord's Supper. And here we have the bread and we have the cup, visible, tangible reminders of the grace of God and his death on the cross for us. And we should be using those more and more to help remind us of his grace, because we need that reminder that we can see and touch and feel. And that's what Jesus said. Do this, what? In remembrance of me. And yet, we have it, what, once a month? Do you know there are some churches that have it every week?
I used to go to one.
Church of Christ
Yeah.
has it every week. Episcopals every week. Lutherans.
They warned the parishioners not to let it become a necklace thing.
Routine.
Yeah, and it's
ritual.
It's a tempting thing. You sit there,
But we have sermons every week and prayers every week, and they say don't let those be a routine.
One thing they did that was good, though, too, is that the Lord's Supper was taken over by the lay people. So in other words, I'd be in charge of the Lord's Supper this week, this week, you the next week. It's good for the congregation in a sense.
Yeah.
Usually you got to come up with a little something to say.
Right. Yeah, I've seen that, Church of Christ. Yeah.
My sister Rebecca goes to a church in Anacortes, and she mentioned to me that they had prophetess, and the women were acting in the capacity that you're saying and doing all this stuff. But I can't find anywhere in the Bible that that's biblical to have that role in the church.
Well, in the Church of Christ, it was just men that did
They wouldn't even allow a woman to speak up. And you can have a doctor's degree in a class with a 10-year-old kid teaching. If he's a baptized kid, you keep quiet.
But the
I
thing...
mean, that's because there was no evidence. As they said, there's no evidence of a woman doing that.
The thing with the women is mainly a lot in the Pentecostal background. and they go to Joel and Acts where Peter says, and the Holy Spirit will be poured out upon our young men and our young maidens, and they will prophesy. So it says, well, since the Pentecost, the women have the Holy Spirit too, and they can prophesy in church. So they base that on that. Your mainline churches use Galatians 3, where it says there's neither male nor female, we're all one in Christ. And they ignore the other verses in Corinthians where Paul says, I allow no woman to speak.
He was doing that though, wasn't he? Because the women were they were just talking and interrupting and causing this,
Yeah, there's a lot of different
the speaking,
views on that. The fact that he says, I allow no woman to speak, was he speaking for himself? Or was it really a word from the Lord? Because a lot of times he'll say, I have it from the Lord. So,
confused me where he says that I say this.
Yeah.
Especially about, as I recall, without going at the women's dress and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a custom of the time.
Yeah, so was he talking?
But he was pretty clear, because he said, thus saith the Lord, and the Lord has said, for I, which he was talking, but he said I take that as him making a statement regarding his belief, feeling, or what he wanted, versus God saying, or God this.
Yeah, so he says, I don't allow any women to speak.
So he's making that specifically, it sounds to me, to him.
But he uses biblical support because he says it was the woman that sinned first, and he goes on in this way. But each denomination has to work that out as far as women preachers.
Confusion was the length of your hair and things like that.
Or women have to have their hair covered in church. For years they'd wear hats in church and say, well, that's biblical. The Bible says I got to cover my head. I don't see women wearing hats in church today.
I was got behind this gal, had a big one like this.
Yeah.
She did.
Well, Easter, they wear them on Easter, I think. But usually they don't wear hats anymore. So we're getting away from, and they'll say those are more cultural guidelines in the Bible.
But you run into, I ran into older people, older generations, that it wasn't cultural to them. That was thou shalt. In other words, if it came out of the scriptures, that's what you did. And
well,
women,
yeah.
It really had, because it was just becoming the women's movement and stuff, and the gals wanted to wear slacks and more jewelry and what have you.
It's because the Bible says a woman shall not wear man's clothing. But it doesn't say anything about a man shall not wear women's clothing.
I know what my wife said. You try struggling with 4 kids in church with a dress on.
Yeah.
I mean, slacks help a lot.
Well, the other thing is used to honor the Sabbath more. People didn't do anything on Sunday. And what was it? I was at a church and I told this pastor, he was a senior pastor, that I was on staff. I told him about this book about the manuscript of Matthew was really written like in 60 AD. I said, it's a great book. I got it out of Barnes & Noble. So he was preaching on a Sunday, and he said, and Pastor Ray gave me this book. He said he was out at Barnes & Noble last Sunday afternoon and found this book, and it's great. After that sermon was over, a retired pastor from Reformed North American Presbyterian Church or something came up to me and said, you call yourself a pastor and you went shopping on Sunday? And that's where they were. They're still in that.
Yeah.
And he's the old Reformed.
Well, I attended the Assembly of God until I was 18. And it was, we always said there's more don'ts than there are do's. I mean, there were so many
we came
rules.
to St. George where the emphasis with the Mormons and that, and you can hardly get your tire pumped up on Sunday. When we came here, none of the stores were open like they are now.
And I don't think that's such a bad thing.
No.
Because, if we're so busy doing our work instead of maybe resting and thinking about the Lord and sharing with your children what
we used to
what
have
that's all about.
a Sunday night service,
We did
So Sunday was pretty. You came home and ate and maybe took a nap and got ready to go back. It was more of an all-day thing than just an hour in the morning. Now we can go do whatever we want to do. So I'm going to start bringing back Sunday evening service here.
Well, the hard part there
You're probably all by yourself.
Can't drive.
is the driving.
No, I'm just teasing.
We have Wednesday night services too, and that was tough.
Wednesday night prayer meeting,
Yeah.
but it was basically a Bible study.
I'll accept it. Didn't hurt me any. It didn't hurt me at all. So much that I remember that I probably wouldn't have if I had not been attending Bible believing church.
Mm-hmm.
Because later on, when I strayed from the Lord, those things come back to me.
Right.
And it was in my heart that I needed to come back to the Lord because it had been hidden in my heart.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think you can get too much of the Lord.
But you didn't come back to all the don'ts and don't cut your hair.
I realized that God isn't a God of just don'ts.
Yeah.
God is a God of love, compassion, and grace, and forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a background where you go all these times during the week and what have you, you learn things like what we're learning today. I defy the first year believer to understand this the way we do. Most of us haven't gone 20 years.
Show me what churches are teaching the Old Testament to begin with. And I don't think there's many do that. But let's go on here and read.
Yeah, it as a kid is a rule, I think.
Yeah. Hosea 13. Would someone read that one?
13?
Hosea 13, 10, 11 on
Where
the...
is your king now
Yeah.
to save you in all your cities, and the rulers to whom you said, give me a king and princes? I gave you a king in my anger and took him away in my wrath.
Here's what you're talking about. When they wanted a king and they got Saul, God wasn't too happy about that because they were they were to be a theocracy. What's a theocracy?
Oh, God.
Ruled directly by God. There was no intermediate. God told the king and the priest what to do. And they didn't want that. We want a king. So he said, I gave you a king in my anger, but then he took him away in his wrath, because what did Saul do? He disobeyed God's command. So he took him away. But if we turn over, this is what happens. Let's look at this again in 1 Samuel 8. If someone will read that, we're getting back to looking when they wanted a king.
And the Lord told him, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights.
So the Lord is telling Samuel, and Samuel was kind of the one leading the country under God's guidance. And when the people told Samuel, we want a king, he went to the Lord, and the Lord said that they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. So go ahead, but tell them what they're going to be in for. And he said, but they've been doing this ever since I led them out of Egypt. They've been forsaking me. They forget me. And isn't this the trouble with churches and Christians always? The tendency is to forget God and His Word and to go on our own way. We've always got to be returning to the Lord.
I mean, I don't want to get off into this and cut her right off, but that would be awfully difficult today, wouldn't it? I mean, to have a theocracy.
Yeah, there's no theocracy today.
Well, the closest you come to it is in the Middle East, where is it Iran, Iraq, what have you?
They think they've got.
I think it's Iran. They're governed by religious leaders only.
Yeah.
They kind of mess things up.
Right. Iran wanted to be. They wanted to be a Muslim state, and they made this new constitution where the religious people would rule it. Not working out too well there, but the first Muslim state officially in their constitution was Pakistan, and then Iran came later. As far as Christian, there's no theocracy. America was never a theocracy ruled by God.
The early pilgrims in that event, weren't they?
The Pilgrims in 1620, when they landed at Plymouth, wrote the Mayflower Compact, and it said right in there, the purpose we've come to America is for the advancement of the Christian faith. Well, you wouldn't be able to get that in any constitution today, because we're open, tolerant. We have to have all faiths. We're interfaith, and we're not a theocracy. We're not a Christian country. The problem is, then what do you base your laws on? If you don't base them on the Ten Commandments.
Of course, the closest
Christ.
we're going to come to one probably be when Jesus runs the show, right?
Yeah, that's what we have to wait for him to return. But they rejected God as a king. Now, we today, to bring this up to date, we reject Jesus Christ as the king of our lives. Christ should be ruling on the throne of our heart as king of our lives.
We don't individually, if we're a Christian, in theory, I mean, or life things, God calls the shots.
Yeah, but this is a little diagram. Have any of you heard of Crusade for Christ? It was out of California, and they had a thing called the Four Spiritual Laws, which was a witnessing tool.
Is that Bill Bright?
Huh?
Was that
Bill Bright. And he was in Arrowhead, remember? They had that big hotel.
I knew him.
Yeah, and he said this circle is a person, and usually he's got the self, and this is a throne, and most people have me on the throne, themselves. And all the activities of their life kind of revolve around themselves. But what happens when you receive Christ, Christ should be on the throne of your life, and then everything else takes a priority under Christ. And what happens is our lives are transformed. We are a new creature, a new creation in Christ. But He's King on the throne of our lives, so we should be obeying Him and following
One of the things
Him.
I ever heard like that, especially for the kids, simple, what would Jesus do? In other words, if you're running your life that way. But I don't think you have to be that deep into the Bible to kind of innately, I think we know a lot of it. Certainly if you knew the Ten Commandments.
Well, Paul says in Romans 1, everybody knows there's a God. And you know there's a conscience. God gives you that. And you know right from wrong. You know justice. But people ignore that. So God gives them over to their own lusts. Go ahead. You know right from wrong, but you don't want to admit it. So I'll give you up to whatever you want to do.
That was sort of talking about homosexuality. Is that not so?
Yeah, and he says, so he gave him up to all these lusts. And they started lusting after the same sex.
But if you just read that in Romans, I'm not sure. I mean, you got to stretch your mind and think it's talking about homosexuals.
No, he says that. And the men lusted for the men, and the women lusted for the women in unnatural uses. Yeah.
Okay, missed that.
That is an unnatural use. Now, people today don't want to admit that because they want to pick and choose through the Bible. But that's in the Old Testament, it's in the New Testament. There's certain things that were in the Old Testament that aren't in the New Testament anymore.
Fairly consistent with most religions, isn't it?
Yeah, and the Muslims are very much against homosexual practice. And the Russian Orthodox Church, Russia has outlawed homosexuality in Russia. But what we're trying to get the idea of a king, because we aren't very much used to talking of kings, but we want to talk about king of our own life, where Christ is the ruler of our lives as we submit ourselves to Him. And one day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that He's Lord, King of Kings. But let's get back here to Samuel, because God tells him, if you read the next part, 10 through 18, this is kind of a long portion, but God wants them to know, look what you're getting into. So if you could read that.
This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his right. He will take your sons and make them serve with the chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest. and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants, your male and female servants, and the best of your cattle and donkeys. He will take for his own, and don't take for his own. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for the relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day.
So that's not really a good thing he's telling them, because he's going to take over everything. Kind of sounds like IRS here.
Sounds like a dictator.
Yeah, he's going to take 1/10 of this and 1/10 of that, and nothing you can do. And
well, that's sort of a communism thing. They theoretically share everything.
well, you know, we didn't have a federal income tax until 1917 under Woodrow Wilson. They had a little bit in Lincoln, the Civil War, and then they did away with that. You know how they finance most of the government? Through customs. Tariffs. Yeah.
Through tariffs?
Uh-huh. So maybe if Trump can get enough tariffs, we can do away with the income tax.
Well, what if you need schools?
Yeah.
They're going to come up and say, hey, we need schools, and everybody chip in $10 out of your paycheck for schools or something?
I'm just saying that before 1917 they didn't have it, but after 1917, guess what exploded in growth after 1917?
Probably war.
Government. Federal government exploded in growth. Kind of reminds you of this passage from 1 Samuel 8. They were taking everything, taking over. Building great monuments, taking over all these things. So he's saying, you know, getting a king's not going to be all that you think it's going to be. But the worst thing is the king as leader didn't lead them into the Word of God. In fact, the king actually got other false gods. Can you think of the example of Solomon? He got all these wives from Egypt and everywhere and brought their gods, and he put their statues in the temple of all places and led them away from devotion to the one God. So let's read Revelation 17:14 to bring it up to New Testament.
Each one of those girls' contempt, you'd be in trouble. With a harem, you know, with lots of ladies.
These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them. For he is the Lord of lords and King of kings.
And this is what we're looking forward to. He is the King of kings. And he will be Lord of lords. He will be the one true ruler out of Jerusalem when he returns. And all will bow their knee to him and confess him as Lord. So the day is coming. So when we see these things falling apart on the news or whatever, we know that it's all God's plan. He's going to work it out when Christ returns. And that's what we have to remember. So King of kings. But right now, he's Lord and King of our own hearts and our lives. Well, let's go on. Someone read verse 4 there.
They have spoken words, swearing falsely in making a covenant. Thus judgment springs up like hemlock in the furrows of the field.
What is hemlock?
Weeds.
Weeds are poisonous.
It's poison, isn't it?
And that's what they get poison from. Who drank the hemlock?
Oh, yeah.
Is that Socrates?
One of the heads of the Egypt, Cleopatra's crowd, wasn't it? Yeah.
But the point is, it'll kill you. It kills you.
Yeah. We have hemlock stumps up in the northwest.
Oh, was poisonous, right?
Who was it who had
I thought that was one of the...
I thought that was Socrates or somebody.
one of the Greeks?
Huh?
One of the Greeks.
Yeah, one of the geeky Greeks, Socrates.
I keep wanting to say Cleopatra. Is that the same?
She was bitten by the snake.
Suicide by asp.
Yeah.
But I think they tried some other stuff.
But the hemlock was poison, and he's saying, look, you're plowing your fields. What's a furrow? That's where he plowed, to plant seeds. But what came up? Something good? No, something bad. And that's what he's saying. The whole point of Israel, you're swearing falsely, and it's not going to be a good result. And hemlock comes up in your furrows. But this was all foretold by God way back to Moses when he brought the people out of Egypt. Someone read that, Deuteronomy 31 for us.
And the Lord said to Moses, Behold, you are about to lie down with your fathers. Then this people will rise and whore after the foreign gods among them in the land that they are entering. And they will forsake me and break my covenant that I have made with them.
So he foretold this. He forewarned them. He said, you're going to go after other gods. You're going to abandon me. But see, they abandoned his word, and they weren't studying his word, and they weren't remembering his promises. And they were going on their own.
Read 2 Kings.
Yeah.
And it's terrible.
They just
murders and,
yeah.
and kill the princes and
It's like a modern day novel. You can see all this happening.
They wouldn't believe it.
Yeah. But it was recorded, Old Testament, and the Apostle Paul says for our advantage, so we can learn from everything in the Old Testament. And that's why we study it today. It's not that we want to think this is a different God, an angry, vengeful God, and we shouldn't read about him. It's the same God, people. Old Testament and the New Testament. It's the same. Well, let's go ahead and get into 2 Kings 17:3. Who would read that?
Against him came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, and Hosea became his vassal and paid him tribute.
yeah.
So we see what happened was Assyria is way over here, and who was the king?
Hosea.
Hosea was the king. So he sought an alliance and a covenant with Assyria. It's not going to last. Hosea, different than Hosea. Here's a little Hebrew lesson for you. There's a letter in Hebrew, kind of looks like a W, and without this dot over it, it's pronounced like a S. But if you put this dot over it, it's an SH. So Hosea would have this, and a little dot became Hosea. What was the group in the Old Testament? They knew they weren't Israelites because they couldn't pronounce that name. Shibboleth. And they would say Sibboleth. And they knew they weren't. So they'd be Shibboleth with the dot. So Hosea was the king, interestingly enough, during the time of Hosea the prophet. And he made this covenant. But let's go on, because the next verse is what we want to read. Verse 4 there. Go ahead, somebody.
But the king of Assyria found treachery in Hosea, for he had sent messengers to So king of Egypt and offered to tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison.
Okay, so Hosea the king, even though he made a covenant with Assyria, who did he send messengers to? Egypt. King So down in Egypt. He's trying to play them both against each other. And he sends messenger to So in Egypt, but guess who heard about it? King of Assyria. He wasn't paying his yearly tribute to Assyria. So what's going on in Israel? Therefore Assyria came down and shut him up in prison. So Hosea was shut up in prison, and the king of Assyria took all of Israel in exile, most of them, back to Assyria. He was trying to buy off Assyria. He was trying to pay them tribute so they wouldn't attack them. Never works out, does it? You have to be strong. So let's finish up with Amos 5:7. Somebody.
O you who turn justice to wormwood and cast down righteousness to the earth.
And this was the problem with Israel. They were unjust, they were unrighteous, they weren't keeping their word, they were going back on their covenant promises, and they were casting righteousness to the earth. Justice, turning justice to wormwood. That's an interesting word there, meaning bitter. Wormwood, meaning bitter. Here's an interesting tidbit. In the Ukrainian language, the Ukrainian word for wormwood is Chernobyl. Yeah, that turned all the waters bitter over there. Kind of a premonition, a sign of what's to come. We read about that in Revelation, didn't we? Turned all the waters bitter into wormwood. That's from Revelation. Chernobyl was the start. So what we see is they're not doing anything righteous. They're turning back on their word. They're not following the Lord, their God, and God brings judgment on them. Do you think God directed Assyria to invade Israel? I do. I think that God uses even non-believing people and nations and countries to do His judgment, because He's Lord of all. And Jeremiah said that He'll lift up nations and He'll tear down nations. And this is what He does. He's going to use, in 70 years later, He's going to use Cyrus, a non-believer, to return the people to Jerusalem. So God is the leader of all things, and He makes it happen.
I like Isaiah's description. It says God whistles for Cyrus.
Yeah, he said, "Come on, boy." And so he came down. So that's what happens. But we need to end there at verse 4. So we will. Is that right? Yeah. And then we will begin verse 5 next week.
That means you're going to have to print up some new sheets.
Yeah, I will have new sheets with new supporting verses for you. I think this helps us stay together.
We'll have this class next week, right?
Yeah.
We will?
We won't have a class on the 25th, right? Is that a Wednesday?
Yeah, this is 5th.
So 3 weeks from today, I'll be traveling to Baltimore or somewhere.
So we do have a class in next week, okay.
Yeah. So it's 3. I've got 3 more weeks. So
All right.
we'll have 2 more classes, okay, before I leave. Next week and the week after. And then you'll have a 2-week break. How about that? Yeah. But don't get out of the habit of coming on Wednesday. Right?
So you volunteer to take your place while you're gone.
Yeah. And no lemon bar.